Now, it was Maria's turn to cry. Tears streamed down her face as I stood firm. Alistair and I will be at the golf course until 4 p.m. When we return, you better be gone, both of you. Kathy, through her sobs, finally spoke. So this is it? You won't even ask me why I cheated. I looked at her, my expression devoid of sympathy. Will it make any difference, Kathy? What's lost is lost. My trust in you and my belief in my ability to keep you happy. Do you really want a husband who will be checking on you every single moment of your life? The room fell silent, the weight of my words sinking into the air like stones dropped into still water. I know you'll say now that you won't mind it, but in a few years, when your guilt fades, you'll feel caged. My mistress would suffocate you, and you'd eventually run away. I said to Kathy, let's end it clean so that I can move on. Kathy and Maria stood speechless as Alistair and I walked out the door. I could only imagine what was going through Maria's mind. If she truly hadn't cheated, the price she was paying for someone else's actions was enormous. From Maria's perspective, the events unfolded like a nightmare. I sat on the bed, overwhelmed, wondering what had just happened. I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't the one cheating. How could this be happening to me? The only thing I was guilty of was supporting a friend when I shouldn't have, and now I was about to lose my marriage over it. As I packed my overnight bag, my heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine finding myself in such a hopeless situation. I held on to the faint hope that our marriage might survive if Ben gave me a chance to explain, but I wasn't naive. Even if we stayed together, the trust we once had would be shattered, and the ease in our relationship would be replaced by tension and suspicion. Kathy was no help in her current state. She was hysterical and consumed by her own problems. I knew I had to leave, but I wasn't sure where to go. I decided on a small motel not far from the house. IT was a comfortable place, but sleep was impossible. I lay there crying, the weight of my decisions crushing me. I couldn't stop thinking about how stupid I had been. While I didn't approve of Kathy cheating on Alistair, I had allowed myself to go along with it. Kathy had convinced me she still loved Alistair and was only doing it for a little thrill. Her rationale hadn't sat well with me, but I had agreed because I thought it was better to keep her meeting Simon at our house rather than at a motel, where the chances of her being caught and hurting Alistair would be much higher. But now, looking back, I could see how wrong I had been. Ben had every reason not to trust me. I had hidden such a massive secret from him. I was an accessory to Kathy's adultery, and in the court of life, I knew I would be tried as such. I had no idea what the future held for me. We didn't have children, and Ben had no reason to stay if his faith in me was shaken. As tears rolled down my face, I realized I was clinging to a fragile hope that seemed more distant with every passing moment. I know Ben better than anyone else in this whole wide world. For him, words like loyalty, honor, love, and promise are not just words. They're the foundation upon which a man's dignity is built. Ben would never give a false word, nor would he deceive anyone. This entire incident wasn't just a betrayal of his trust. It was a betrayal of his core beliefs. His straight-arrow moral compass would make him see this as a failure, not just in me, but also in Alistair in the morning. I tried calling Ben repeatedly, but he never answered. It was imperative that I got hold of him. I called his office, only to be told he had taken a week's leave and was out of town. Desperate, I tried calling Alistair to explain everything to him. While Alistair did pick up the phone once, he hung up as soon as he realized it was me. Meanwhile, Kathy was inconsolable. Her marriage was over, and she had no hope left. Kathy's life had always been fragile. She never studied beyond high school due to her parents' untimely death. After their passing, Alistair's parents took her in, but they weren't wealthy and couldn't afford to send her to college or arrange for any higher education. Kathy had depended entirely on Alistair as an extremely good provider. She never needed to work. In contrast, I had worked my whole life, even though Ben was a very successful man. Now, Kathy had nowhere to turn. All she could rely on was the money she might get in a settlement after the divorce. She lacked any marketable skills except for cooking, and even that wasn't enough to guarantee her a job for the first 2 days. I tried to remain positive, hoping that Ben would come back once he felt I had been punished enough. But that hope evaporated the moment I was served with divorce papers. The reason listed was irreconcilable differences. For more than 8 years, I had invested my heart and soul into this marriage. I wasn't just Ben's wife. I was also his best friend. Of course, like any relationship, we had our highs and lows, but we had always fought for each other to stay together. We were supposed to do this forever. Ben was a loving and caring husband and an incredible partner in every way. So why had I lied to him? Or rather, why had I withheld the truth? Technically, I hadn't lied outright, but I hadn't told him the full story either. I knew how deeply his friendship with Alistair would be tested. Even if our marriage survived, their friendship might not. Alistair would never be able to look me in the face again. And it wasn't just Alistair. Ben's friends would judge me as a person who condoned adultery. They'd never see me the same way again. My social life, my relationships with those around me, everything was going to change drastically. No matter what the outcome, this wasn't just a test of our marriage. It was a test of my entire world. Maria called me after receiving the divorce papers. To my surprise, I picked up the phone. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I think you're taking this a little too far. If you just talk to me, it would become clear. Please, Ben, I deserve a few minutes of your time." Her pleading struck a chord, though I tried not to let it show. "Why don't you come over to the house?" I said, my tone calm. "We can talk over coffee." She agreed quickly, and I hung up, unsure of how I felt. Perhaps this conversation would finally give me clarity. I didn't know what I was going to do. This wasn't a lie we couldn't get past. After all, she hadn't been the one cheating. But my problem wasn't with her lie itself. Spouses tell convenient lies to each other all the time. That's not what had shaken me. The issue was her moral stance. If she had kept Kathy's indiscretion a secret while working to help her friend break her self-destructive behavior, I might have understood. That would have made sense, even earned my respect. But what she had done, condoning Kathy's actions and allowing that man to be in our home, was beyond my understanding. How could I respect her judgment when it so clearly conflicted with mine? Welcome to our channel. Let's dive into today's story. It was a long drive from the airport to my house, and my mind was racing as I navigated the freeway. Let me backtrack to explain what had me so deep in thought. I had been in Denver all week for a conference, and on Thursday, my best friend Alistair called me with news that flipped my world upside down. His exact words were, "That woman has been cheating on me. I've thrown her out of the house, and I'm sure she'll end up spending the night at your place." Kathy staying at my house wasn't unusual. She and my wife, Maria, often stayed with each other whenever one of us was traveling. If I was away, Kathy would stay with Maria, and if Alistair was gone, the reverse would happen. We were like 4 peas in a pod, friends since high school. The thought of any of us cheating on our spouses was unimaginable. I travel for work about 2 weeks each month, and whenever possible, I try to bring Maria along, but realistically, it doesn't happen often. Logistically, I'm the one with the most opportunities to stray, but I haven't. Not once. So hearing this news from Alistair threw me for a loop. He told me that early that morning, he had decided to stop by my house to have breakfast with Kathy and Maria. But when he arrived, he found an unexpected scene. From the patio, he could see Kathy and a man, a stranger to him, having breakfast with Maria. Kathy was being overly affectionate with this man, and Maria was laughing and chatting with him as if he had been a lifelong friend. The most shocking part? Kathy was sitting in the man's lap during breakfast, and he was dressed in nothing but boxers. Now, I'm not a prude by any means, but the idea of a man sitting at my breakfast table in his boxers while I was away didn't sit right with me. It felt too liberal, even for me. But this wasn't just anyone telling me this. It was Alistair, the man I trust with my life. Taking his words in stride was difficult, to say the least. Still, I needed to get the whole story before jumping to conclusions. When I entered the house, I found Kathy sitting in the living room casually watching television, as if nothing was wrong. Maria was nowhere to be seen, but since her car was in the garage, I was sure she was home. "Hey, Kathy, how are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and neutral, as if I knew nothing about what had happened. She glanced at me and smiled. "I'm all right. How was your trip?" "Maria's in the shower. She should be down shortly." Her casual demeanor made me bristle internally, but I maintained my composure. There was no sense in letting her know I was aware of anything, at least not yet. I sat down on the couch and took off my shoes, trying to act casual. "How's Alistair?" I asked. "He hasn't called me all week. We were supposed to play golf this weekend. Do you know if it's still on?" Kathy answered vaguely, her tone light. "If he hasn't called to cancel, I'm sure it's still on." Maria came down shortly after, taking in the situation with a quick glance before welcoming me warmly. "Do you want breakfast?" she asked as we headed to the kitchen. Maria casually mentioned that Kathy and Alistair had a fight, some misunderstanding, and that Kathy would be staying with us until Alistair came to his senses. "He'd better come to his senses," I replied, pulling out my cell phone. Without hesitation, I dialed Alistair and asked him to come over. At first he protested, but after I insisted, he reluctantly agreed. Alistair trusted me implicitly, and I knew he'd listen. After finishing my call, I returned to my breakfast while Maria headed back to the living room. I could hear a lively conversation between her and Kathy, the tones rising and falling with emotion. When I stepped into the living room, Kathy looked on the verge of tears, and Maria turned to me with a disapproving look. "You shouldn't have called Alistair," Maria said firmly. "Kathy's not ready to face him. It's not our place to meddle in their affairs." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm not meddling in their affair. When you took Kathy and after Alistair threw out, it was out of concern, wasn't it? What I'm doing is also out of concern. After all, it's just a misunderstanding. I'm sure we'll all be laughing about this before the day is over." Just then, the doorbell rang. I opened it and invited Alistair inside. As he stepped into the living room, Maria and Kathy stood up, their expressions tense. Once we all settled, I turned to Alistair. "So," I said, "what exactly is this misunderstanding?" Alistair's face hardened. "The only misunderstanding I know of is in Kathy's mind," he replied coldly. "Kathy misunderstood how I'd react after finding out she's been hanging around on me for about a year." I raised my eyebrows in mock disbelief. "Come on, don't be crazy. Kathy would never do something so deceitful, so disgusting, ever in her whole life." My voice dripped with sarcasm, and I intended to milk the occasion for all it was worth. Kathy could use a dose of reality. "Now, Alistair, you remember how she reacted when you danced with that busted blonde during our vacation in Hawaii? Someone who had such a low tolerance for even the hint of a third party would never, ever be part of something so cruel and hurtful." I let the words hang in the air, watching Kathy squirm under the weight of the conversation. I continued. "Maria would have nipped this in the bud. If Kathy had even entertained such an idea, Maria would never sit back and watch as your dreams are trampled and your children's lives are set adrift on a leaky boat in a stormy sea." Turning to Kathy, I asked, "Why aren't you saying something?" Before she could respond, Alistair interjected. "How will she say anything, Ben? I have evidence." He pulled out his phone and showed me a picture. The image was shocking. Kathy was sitting on the lap of a man, wearing only boxer shorts. My jaw tightened as I exclaimed, "This is my house." I turned to Maria, my tone sharp. "Will you tell me what misunderstanding caused Alistair to throw Kathy out?" Maria stood silently, unable to meet my gaze. She had no explanation to offer. "Where were you while this was happening?" I pressed. Alistair answered for her, his voice filled with anger. She was right there, talking to them and serving them breakfast. "And where was your stud?" I asked Maria, my voice cold and pointed. Maria gasped, her eyes widening as she realized where my line of questioning was headed. She quickly spoke up. "There is no one, Ben. Believe me, I've never been with another man. I could never cheat on you. I respect you too much, and I love you too much to do anything like this." Her words came in a rush as she continued. "It was only Kathy who used to have her lover over. I protested, but I couldn't run my best friend down, so I kept quiet." I shook my head, my voice laced with disbelief. "I have no reason to believe you, and even if I did, why should I live with someone who condones such blatant disregard for marital vows?" I turned to Kathy, who was now crying hysterically. Then I shifted my gaze back to Maria. "I hope you have a third friend who is more accommodating, because tonight, neither of you are sleeping in this house. I'm not saying this is the end of my marriage, but it certainly feels like it." Looking back at Kathy, I added, "I hope and pray Alistair never so much as looks at you again. He's young and will have no trouble finding someone who values loyalty. As for you, Kathy, maybe you'll find a man who believes in open marriage if the stud of yours doesn't work out." I was lost in these thoughts when Maria's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out and hesitated for a moment before walking toward the front door. She was modestly dressed, at least not trying to steer the conversation with her usual charm. I waited for her to enter, but instead, she stopped and rang the bell. It struck me that she was more unsure of me than I was of her. My plan had been to unsettle her as soon as she walked in, but it wasn't necessary. When I opened the door, I saw a tear glistening in her eye, and despite her attempts to appear composed, she looked lost. She was barely holding herself together. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said in a near whisper. As we sat down, I said, "I would like to hear your rationale behind lying to me." My voice steady but cold, I continued. "Explain to me how you can justify this. You've ruined everything we've built over the last 8 years. Yes, I have broken your trust, but I have not broken any of my marital vows. I still respect you, Ben, and I love you with all my heart. I have never once doubted our devotion to this marriage." Her voice grew steadier as she continued. "What I am guilty of is bad judgment. Judgment in dealing with an affair I wasn't even a part of. I'm guilty of hiding something from you that, frankly, most women would have hidden from their husbands. Kathy isn't the first woman we know who has cheated, and in almost every case I knew about the affair before you did." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in, then went on. "You never questioned why I didn't disclose these things to you as soon as I found out. It's because you've never been interested in those kinds of things. You've always kept yourself above gossip and drama, and I respected that. I know this is different for you because Alistair is such a close friend," Maria continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But you have to understand that Kathy is a very close friend of mine, too. I didn't condone her affair. I was trying to manage it, to keep it a secret while I worked on making Kathy see some sense. If she had met her boyfriend at some motel, word would have spread, and Alistair would have found out. I didn't want that to happen." She took a breath and pressed on. "What I was doing seemed like the best course of action at the time. Had I known it would cost me so dearly, I would have left Kathy in her sordid affair alone. Despite everything, I wasn't able to stop her. She kept justifying her actions to me. She even told me that Alistair didn't satisfy her in bed. That's why this was necessary, according to her." Maria's voice wavered, but she continued. "She promised me that once the affair ran its course, she would return to being a faithful wife to Alistair. All I wanted was to save their marriage, one way or another." As she paused, I realized that in her own misguided way, she had been trying to do what she thought was best for Kathy and Alistair. My problem wasn't just with what she had done. It was with my lack of faith in her. It was my faith that had faltered. I knew what she did was wrong. She should have discussed it with me and kept me in the loop. But was I really ready to throw away a perfectly good marriage over her half-baked idea about Kathy's affair? I didn't think so. What I was sure of, however, was that Alistair would be furious when I told him tomorrow that I was asking Maria to move back in. In his eyes, she was guilty by association, and honestly, I wasn't sure I disagreed with him. All I knew for certain was that I was too selfish to let Maria slip away just to satisfy Alistair's anger. Hadn't I essentially asked Maria to put our marriage ahead of her friendship with Kathy? Shouldn't I be doing the same by putting our marriage ahead of my friendship with Alistair? I doubted that many would see Maria as a true culprit in all of this. She was a victim of her own poorly executed plan, but she wasn't a villain by any stretch of the imagination. Perhaps this decision would come back to haunt me, but I was willing to take that chance. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that her judgment had been compromised. How loose had her moral boundaries become in the push and pull of Kathy's affair? That was a question I couldn't yet answer. But for now, I knew I wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.